Mary Stout is our past president. She was our second president and had the distinction of being the first woman to lead a national veterans organization. I'd like Mary to come up for a minute. Come on down, Mary. If you saw the video of the first VVA convention, there was a young lady there who was making sure these guys got things done right, and that was Mary. At the time, you were the executive director of the Ohio State Council, I think, or something.
No, I was the member. I'd been that before.
You've been that before?
I was the membership director.
Membership director, that was it.
83.
Please, say a few words to the gang.
Okay. Well, I'm going to say more than a few words. First of all, I want to thank you, John. This is the first time I've had the privilege of addressing this convention since George Duggins was the president. So it's nice to see you. It's wonderful to see so many old faces and old friends and some of you from back in '83. I'm sorry, young faces, but so many new faces and new people involved. But I want to quickly tell you a story. Whenever I tell this story to VVA members, they say, why don't we know this? It's a story about early VVA. And it's a story about Agent Orange. When I first joined the chapter in Columbus, Ohio, the very first day I walked into that chapter, and they were doing employment help at a building in the worst part of town, run down. Chapter 16, they wore t-shirts, orange t-shirts, that said, Vietnam veteran, a right to be proud. And I knew I had come home, finally, because I'd been home from Vietnam for 13 years, and I'd never been able to take pride in that service. And they were talking about Agent Orange, and I thought, this is a great idea. This brings people in. You know, we can talk to veterans about there's a problem here, and we want to work on this, but I didn't really think we ever were going to find anything out about it, because there was nothing to find out. But Ohio had an Agent Orange Commission, so we were handing out literature. Then when I got to be the executive director of the Ohio State Council, there were 2 phone calls that made me say, there's something really here. This is something long-term. This is something we have to do. And they were both wives of Vietnam veterans who had died. One of them was a young man who died from soft tissue sarcoma, and she called up to see, she had 3 little kids, was very young, to see if there was any way the VA would help her get some education so that she could support her family. And of course, there was nothing we could do. But I talked her into coming into Columbus, because she lived in Lancaster, to come in and make a claim at the regional office. And I said, you're not going to get anything now, but if we can work this out, maybe someday you and your children will get the help that you deserve. The other was the wife of a ranch hander who had been in the ranch hand study, and many of you remember that. That was people that flew the aircraft that sprayed Agent Orange. And he had been in that study 6 weeks down in New Mexico, and all the medical tests and all that all came out and said, yeah, nothing here. A month after he came home from ranch hand, he died of a massive heart attack. And his doctor said to his wife, it's too bad that we didn't get a chance to see him earlier, because we would have caught this. I said to myself, what was that ranch hand about? Did they really look at these people? So those 2 things were important to me as I moved through. And who was at the convention in 1983? Okay. In 1983, Congressman Sonny Montgomery, the chair of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, came to that convention and proudly announced that they had passed Agent Orange legislation that would give compensation for chloracne and perfluorocatena tardive. Of course, you had to have been diagnosed within 6 months of coming home from Vietnam, and we're now in 1983, hello. Oh, I don't know if anybody ever got compensation for that, but we were all thrilled because something had happened, and he was there to tell us about it. And after that, for about 2 years, nothing happened. Nothing was going on. There was no science. I mean, we were looking at it. We had Agent Orange commissions in states. We're talking to people. We had people like George Claxton collecting every piece of information you could possibly find on it. But we couldn't find, what can we do? We can't find that link that Congress is asking us. Where's the silver bullet? I got elected National Secretary in 1985, and I think it was the next summer. I went off to a little program that was going on with the chapter in Washington, D.C., and the guy that was running the program, afterwards, I gave him a ride home. And he said, oh, why don't you come up and say hello to Angie and have a beer? Angie was his wife. She happened to be a epidemiologist at the Environmental Protection Agency. And we're talking, and she says to me, so, what is VVA doing about Agent Orange? And I said, well, there's really nothing. We've looked at it, we just don't know where to go. And she said, you cannot give up. The Environmental Protection Agency had just bought out Times Beach, Missouri, because there was oil spread on the roads there that had dioxin in it, and they bought out the whole town. She said, you can't give up. You've got to do something. Kind of stuck with me. It was a real challenge. So I went back to Bobby Mueller, then the president, and said, can we do something? And he's saying there's nothing. I said, can I put together a group of people to talk about this, to find out if there's anything that they're thinking about, bring in some people from around the country. And he kind of reluctantly agreed to it, because VBA didn't have a lot of money, and we didn't have blue ribbon committees and stuff like that, but I had one weekend, and I brought in Joe Bangert from Massachusetts, who was then the executive director of their Agent Orange study. I brought in, and I can't remember his name, from New Jersey, who was the executive director of their study. He ran against me for president, I think the first or second time. I also got from our legal services, we got one of their lawyers, and Ginny Richards, who had been putting information together, and they recommended I get the lawyer who represented Monsanto employees in West Virginia where there had been a dioxin spill, and he had represented them in a court case. And they didn't win the court case, though the court never said it wasn't dioxin that caused this. The reason that they didn't win is because the court said you have workman's compensation to take care of that kind of stuff. But he was important to be there. And I invited Angie. I called her up and said, you started it, you come. And it was Angie Oletta, some name that you've never heard and nobody ever talks about, who was the real person behind the idea of increased risk. She talked to us. I mean, we were in there yelling, we're just going to go for it. They can't do this to Vietnam veterans. We're just going to say this stuff is caused by it, and Congress, you have to do something. And she's going, ain't going to happen. But she talked to us about increased risk and what that meant. So we took that information and worked with our board and worked with all the people around the country working on Agent Orange and worked with members of Congress to put together that piece of legislation. And then we and you and many people around the country started talking about it with their legislators. And it took years. That was 1986. Finally, we had the bill together. It was, the National Academy of Science was going to do the investigative work at looking at whatever studies were done and making a determination of, is there an increased risk for people exposed to dioxin for these kind of things? And it was John Kerry who insisted on that. And we're in his office, like being Vietnam veterans, no government stuff, like we always did. He said, this is the premier group. This is who we have to have. So we put the legislation together working with John Kerry and Lane Evans, and Congressman Bonner and Tom Daschle, and then started the very hard work of meeting with all those members, of particularly the House Veterans Affairs Committee, us meeting with them, our members meeting with them. We finally got to the point where the Healthcare Committee was going to bring up this bill in the subcommittee. And for the first time in all these years, we had enough votes. We could get that piece of legislation out of the subcommittee. We'd never get it out of the committee, the full committee, but we had the subcommittee votes. And Doug Applegate from Ohio was the chair of the subcommittee. So the day that they had their subcommittee hearing on this, and they took the vote, Sonny Montgomery, who was the chair of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, and Bob Thump, who was the ranking minority member, came to that committee meeting. Never happened on other subcommittees, but happened on that one. And because of their positions, they had votes on the committee, and they voted it down. I mean, talk about heartbreak. Talk about heartbreak. But Paul Egan, who was then our legislative director, Rick Weidman was up in New York at the time, he and I went to see Congressman Applegate and talked to him about this. Is there anything we can do? What can we do? And he finally decided, along with us, that he was going to withhold his support for some piece of legislation that Sonny Montgomery really wanted, unless Sonny Montgomery allowed that bill to come to the full committee. And we knew we didn't have the votes. But Sonny Montgomery, for some reason, said, okay, I'll take your support on this, we'll bring it up, and scheduled the markup of that legislation, which we didn't have the votes for, on the opening day of our National Leadership Conference in Reston, Virginia. And we gathered up every person from the districts of those members of the House Veterans Affairs Committee. And on the morning of the hearing, we bussed them to Capitol Hill. And they knew, because they, like you, have legislative, people working on legislation, they knew those members, and those members knew them. They walked to their offices and said, we're here to walk with you to the committee hearing, and we expect your vote in the positive on this Agent Orange bill. And you know what? We won! We won! A miracle. And from that piece of legislation, that idea that never was put forth before of increased risk, we have been able to build. More illnesses have been associated with Agent Orange. We're asking to look at the increases for people who served in the wars after that. What are they exposed to? What's going on with them? That all needs to be studied. But that started out with us. No other veteran service organization at that time, supported the Agent Orange legislation at all. So, well, that's sorry, it's not about me. I was involved in that, but there were hundreds of you and hundreds of people that we don't have anymore involved in making that happen. And that's what you continue to do. And I'm so proud to stand here as your past president and listen to John talking about the things that you're working on now. Keep going. Don't give up, because great things can happen. Miracles can happen when you just keep going. Thank you very much.